Hello, everybody. We are now under a month from one of the most surreal elections, presidential elections in American history, although I'm sure everyone says that every year. Supposed to be the most consequential election, at least according to everyone, both on the left and the right. My guess is whoever wins, it's not going to change very much at all. Meanwhile, we have a supposedly conservative candidate who's about to radically transform or claim to radically transform America, and a supposedly progressive candidate who is about as conservative as anything I could ever imagine, who doesn't seem to want to change anything. It takes some imagination and I think some erudition to make sense of what is actually happening. And one young scholar, I think, who does this, in contrast to so many other people in America, is my guest today, Timothy Shenk. He was on the show a couple of years ago. He had an interesting new book at the time called Realigners, the visionary hacks who have radically transformed American democracy. And it tended to focus particularly, I think, on the right. He had some interesting things to say about Phyllis Schlafly. And Tim now is back with another interesting book, which might make sense of the surreal nature of the 2024 election. It's called Left Adrift: What Happened to Liberal Politics. Tim Shenk teaches at GW University, George Washington University in DC. Tim, congratulations on the new book. Do you agree that there is something particularly odd about this election?
I think surreal is a good description, and maybe it feels a little bit normal now that we're not literally replaying 2020. But it does feel, I think, hopefully, as if we're coming to the end of something, and that at some point next time, we really will be able to turn the page, at least by ending the Trump years in some way. Whatever happens next, doesn't seem likely that Trump will be on the ballot in 2028.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Maybe. Yeah.
tempt fate. I think people said the same last time around. Um, what about this idea, though, that this is such a consequential election? Do you agree? Maybe I'm wrong, but whoever wins, nothing much is really going to change. We're just going to have the same old arguments, the same old struggles, the same old gridlock in Congress.
Well, this is the question, right? Because I'll be honest, I was opposed to
I hope
Trump.
you're always honest, Tim,
Yeah,
with me.
I will be especially honest on this tricky point. I was opposed to Trump as everyone else I knew was in 2016, but I did not expect the type of scene that we saw on January 6th. To me, that was a beyond worst case plausible scenario, and so I'm reluctant to rule out something truly catastrophic happening in a potential next Trump term, just because January 6th was, in my mind, like a pretty not a coup, but something that does count as legitimately shocking. But what I would say too is that the underlying dynamic in American politics that's brought us to this point, you know, even once we get beyond Trump, I think we'll still be stuck with some of the same broken political dynamics that have brought us here and that have been in place for more than half a century.
Well, it was the so-called populists on show, for better or worse, on January 6th. Your new book, Left Adrift: What Happened to Liberal Politics, and you are explaining what happened to liberal politics, focuses on the progressive side of American politics. I want to get into the details of the book, but from an overall position, what has happened to liberal politics? Does it even exist, Tim, in 2024 in America?
Well, the dodge that I make is by talking about liberal politics instead of liberalism. I shift the conversation a little bit to from a question about what is sort of the essence of this thing called liberalism. I focus more on who are the people who are drawn to whatever this thing liberalism is. And one clear story that you can tell over the long arc of American history over the last 60 years is the transformation of a Democratic Party that was once it was a bottom up coalition grounded in organized labor to this stranger assemblage today, kind of alliance of professional class where universities count for more than unions. And that transformation is really at the heart of my book.
Let's go back a little bit before the 60-year point, back to FDR and the coalition he put together. That always seemed to me to be the unholiest alliance, the weirdest marriage of segregationalists and labor unions, intellectual leftists, and African Americans. How did the FDR coalition get transformed into the post-war one? Were they similar? What was missing and what got added?
So the important thing to know about the New Deal coalition is that it's an exception to the rule in American history. This division of American politics, broadly speaking, into a party of the haves, which were the Republicans after 1936, and the party of the have-nots. That's not the norm in American history, where cross-class alliances divided as much or more by culture as by anything else is the standard. And I will point out that's not an particularly American aberration. Across most of the world, especially the wealthy world, class politics is hard to come by, even though class itself is obviously an incredibly important sociological fact. It often doesn't express itself neatly at the polls in the way that it more or less did in the United States for a significant period of time after the Great Depression. The reason why is that the Depression enabled FDR, enabled the Democrats to put economic issues at the front and center of the political debate. And so an electorate that had, for instance, before 1932, although African Americans overwhelmingly disenfranchised in the South, there's a significant presence of African Americans in the North and in the Midwest. They tended to vote Republican before FDR came along. But then the New Deal arrives, and even though Democrats are still the party of the solid South, they were also the party that's responsible for lifting millions of African Americans out of poverty over the long period from the 30s into the 60s. And that results in the short run in African Americans voting for FDR. The first time Democrat had carried that vote in 1936. And when you have this alliance, as you were saying, that stretches literally from Harlem to unreconstructed white supremacists in South Carolina, it results in a strong class divide in American politics that is able to persist until things really come apart in the 1960s.
So, on the one hand, you argue that that American liberalism or liberal politics was defined by class politics in the 40s and 50s in the post FDR period. But how does that square, Tim, with the assumption? I mean, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the assumption that in the 50s, for example, the parties weren't that dramatically ideologically divided. In other words, did the class politics of the Democratic Party in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, did it translate into political radicalism, or did it sort of just become part of an Eisenhower-style foggy middle?
Well, but the point is about the Eisenhower-style foggy middle is that it itself was an accommodation to the New Deal order. And the deal of the 1950s is that Republicans would give up on attempts to repeal the New Deal, just as Democrats would give up on attempts to expand it in a significant way. So even though the class politics, the comparatively economically divided electorates of the 1950s, even though it didn't lead to a radical expansion of the New Deal's experiments with social democracy, it was able to more or less protect them, which is why you have in those 30 years after World War II, a period of both significant economic growth and comparatively high economic equality rather. And that is what breaks down in the 1970s, which a economic change, the resurgence of economic inequality that follows the sort of rupture, the crisis of the political crisis, and that leads to the breakdown of the New Deal coalition in the 1960s. So I would say that sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go on.
I would say that I'm going to continue to be honest here and point out that this formula of economically polarized electorates leads to more social democracy. It's a recurring feature across much of the world, but it's not universal. Canada, for instance, has a more robust welfare state than the United States does, and never had a sort of similarly economically polarized electorate. So it's not by itself a guarantee of social democracy, but I do think it is an important force. And it is still hard for me, knowing at least the details of American history, to imagine the New Deal taking shape as it did without the electoral backing provided by that bottom-up coalition.
Tim, we've done a number of shows on what you might think of as realignment on the left. Several people argue that what happened in the 60s was this cleavage between left radicals, anti-Vietnam people, and the American working class. It was manifested in all sorts of complicated ways in terms of unions. Is that true? Is that what happened? We had a shift between the new left, if you like, and the old left.
Not neatly and not all at once. The way that I think about this is that it's as and for the from the perspective of the left, this is a long process that doesn't these realignments don't take place overnight, or at least they don't often take place overnight. And it's almost as if the Democrats decide to go into the spooky haunted house in the 1960s, and then it's around 2010, 2016 that they go into the basement where all the weird noises are coming from. There is a basic structure that does result in some really significant changes
Are
in the
we near
electorate.
Halloween, Tim?
Exactly. So you can tell I've got some kids who are jonesing for a candy infusion soon. But what I mean by this is that Democrats were still able to rely on a lot of durable partisan loyalties from people who just could not imagine ever voting for a Republican. But it is also a fact that by 1972, Richard Nixon is able to do extraordinarily well for a Republican with working class voters. Reagan repeats that in the 1980s. And then Trump comes along and, in a sense, drives the nail into the coffin, at least for white working class voters. And the real question for today is whether he's going to see significant inroads with Black and Hispanic working class voters in 2024. It's not certain how that's going to play out, but there has definitely been backsliding from a Democratic perspective on that front over the last decade. And I do think that the underlying problem gets to what you could very simply say is a displacement of those pocketbook New Deal issues at the center of the political debate with these more socially, culturally charged, polarized questions that emerge really at the center of the stage in the 1960s.
Tim, and we've talked about this in all sorts of ways with people like Thomas Frank, a left populist. Has the American working class really ever been united, particularly across race, in the last 100 years since the end of the 19th century? Were there moments when white and Black workers voted for the same candidate and were comfortable with each other?
So this is the extraordinary part of that New Deal moment, that in a sense, it's a realization of the populist dream that Tom Frank talks about. Sort of the populists of the 1890s who envisioned a divide between the farmers and the factory laborers against the capitalists. You don't get the revolutionary promise that some might have seen there, but it is more or less a decent sociological description of the electorate from the 30s down to the 1960s. Is it perfect? No, of course not. It's never going to be, but there's still at least a potential there. It has happened once before. Whether we can bring it back today, very open to debate. But just as a historian, this is not some unimaginable ideal. It was a more or less faithful approximation with lots and lots of caveats in the middle of the 20th century.
So you're really interested in this ideological realignment, both in realigners and left adrift. You mentioned Nixon and his so-called Southern strategy and his recognition that the white working class now was up for grabs. I think LBJ, after he signed the Civil Rights Act, suggested that he was signing away the white working class, or at least in the South. It takes two to tango on this, Tim, doesn't it? So can you think about the left independently of conservatives, of the right? Are these two, so to speak, moving elevators which pass each other in the night, but aren't necessarily mechanically connected?
Well, the right is definitely, you cannot think of them independently, but that doesn't mean that you can assume that there's no agency in the process either. So the right can do what it's going to do, but the left has a choice in how it responds to it. And that's really what drove me to this book, was seeing that there was a debate within elite democratic circles that spread in ways that were surprising to me around the world over how left and center left parties could respond politically to the emergence of this cultural divide, the rise of a new kind of polarization, and the potential that it offered for the right to make major inroads with working class voters. Up until doing the research for this book, I had basically assumed either that this polarized politics was something that the Democratic elite welcomed because it gave them a chance to win over affluent suburbanites. The line that was always in my head was a Chuck Schumer in 2016 saying that for every blue collar voter that Democrats lost in Pennsylvania, they would pick up two ex-Republicans in the Philadelphia suburbs. I basically assumed that had been Democratic strategy going back 40 years, or that the party had just been confused and stumbled into the future without a coherent plan. What I discovered instead is that there were some very important strategists who diagnosed the importance, who saw the importance of polarization early on, and who believed that it could be potentially fatal for Democrats, and that the only way for Democrats to survive in this transformed electoral environment was by taking polarization head on. And what I further discovered was that there was a real debate over the best way to do that. Debate that starts, weirdly enough, in academic texts in the 1970s, gets applied on the ground in the US in local and state races in the 1980s, scales up nationally in the Clinton years, and then gets exported around the world. And once I had that story in my head, both the making of the modern left and the modern right started to look different to me. I saw a lot more choice, where before I had seen either ignorance or inevitability.
Yeah, I really like what you're doing, particularly in building it around Clinton and the narrative of his presidency. I think it's the key 8 years, even if it was the uneventful, boring 90s. I think that the realignment or reinvention of the left, or the, I don't know, maybe it's no longer the left, of liberalism, whatever you want to call it, is key. And you do in this book, you've got this intriguing narrative where you build this realignment or rethinking of liberal politics of the left around two pollsters, Stanley Greenberg, whoever, we've all heard of these people, and Doug Schoen, who both worked for Clinton and who loathe one another. How did you stumble on this narrative, and what do Greenberg and Schoen tell us about the condition, the state of the left in the 2020s?
So when I was finishing Realigners, the last book, which, as you're saying, it tells a story about the rise and fall of electoral majorities over the long run in American history, I had closed that book with two chapters. One was on the making of the populist right, which is a story I told through Phyllis Schlafly, and on the other was the creation of a new type of Democratic Party, which I told through Barack Obama. I realized that there was this sort of part that I left out of the story. Sort of what was the left doing? What were Democrats doing in the age of Schlafly, in during this period post LBJ, pre Barack Obama? And coincidentally enough, around this time, some friends of mine were working on a conference and they wanted someone to write about debates in the Democratic political class in the Clinton years. So I thought this would be a really nice couple-week project where I could just fill in this gap in the book and then move on to the rest of my life. And what I discovered when I looked in the story was that almost immediately it was a lot more surprising than I anticipated. That story I had in my head, either about clueless neoliberals in the Clinton years Macarenaing their way to electoral disaster, or about this conscious strategy to sell out the working class, more or less, didn't match the reality at all. And how I got there was the fact that though Greenberg and Schoen are decently well known for political consultants, their respective partners, for Stan Greenberg, it's James Carville, and for Schoen, it was Mark Penn. Those were people who I was very, very familiar with. And I had the story in my head. I knew that there had been some sort of a debate between the Carville wing and the Penn wing of the Democratic Party. And as someone who, an old millennial, I came up swooning over Barack Obama in 2008. I was a Bernie guy in 2016, never terribly inclined to like the Clintons all that much. But I discovered that with Greenberg and Schoen, it's going too far to say that they were the brains of their operations, but they were the PhDs. And they had done serious academic research on these questions and political science before going into political consulting. And that I could see them working through in real time. These are two guys who they're baby boomers, so born in the aftermath of World War II. They see the New Deal coalition in its last days. They watch its crack up taking place in real time. And the question of what Democrats do next was at the forefront of their consciousness. And it turns out that, as I mentioned earlier, they had serious strategies for dealing with this problem, but they were very, very opposed. That Greenberg, and through Greenberg Carville and large sections of the Democratic consultant class, believed that it would be possible for Democrats to bring back that New Deal coalition if they ran hard on economic populism with a kind of culturally moderate backing. On the converse side, Schoen believed that the only way that Democrats could win elections in an environment that he believed now sort of the natural majority of the United States after the 1960s was Republican. Schoen said the only way to win is a comprehensive move to the center on economic and social issues, because he said that economic populism didn't even really move working class voters anymore. But importantly, Schoen said that Schoen and Penn believed that even though Democrats would be foolish to turn away potential gains in the suburbs, there was no way to win a national majority without doing significantly well with working class voters. So that blindness to the working class that I had assumed wasn't there, even with someone like Mark Penn, who had just, in my image, had been the total face of a kind of empty third way corporate politics. No, no, no. It turns out that there was a much more sophisticated argument going on than I'd been aware of at the time.
And were Greenberg and Schoen, were they themselves examples of a technocratic elite? I mean, even the idea of a pollster is so intellectually offensive in my mind. Maybe I'm sure I'm a bit of a snob when it comes to these sorts of things. But were these both Greenberg and Schoen? They're both still around. They must be quite old now. And on Greenberg's X page, he still has, it's the middle class stupid, the sort of
yeah, it doesn't seem like he tends to it all that much. That's several books ago for him at this point.
Schoen seems to have disappeared a bit. He has an X page too. But as pollsters, what does that tell you, that these two figures were so influential? Does it suggest, and this is the standard view of Clinton, that it essentially was a sellout, that they figured out how to win elections and what you needed to say to win elections, and then they said it, or they got Bill Clinton to say it?
So, especially with Greenberg, who I'm full disclosure, I disagree with elements of Greenberg's strategy. The man is by no means a saint, but I came to deeply, deeply admire what he was trying to do. And maybe through that, I came to a deeper appreciation for polls and even the sort of hated object of focus groups than I had going into this. Like, listen, yes, they are imperfect, but they are the best tools we have for approaching at this thing, public opinion, which I do think, even if there's not a sort of crystalline representation of what 300 million people think, that it is a question worth puzzling through. What do ordinary Americans actually think about the major issues facing them in the world? And Greenberg in particular, he just has both a sincere devotion to this social democratic politics and a real belief that polling, and actually with him, especially focus groups. One of the sort of most indelible scenes I came across while researching this book was Greenberg describing listening to a group of African American voters in a focus group he convened for Bill Clinton in 1992, talking about how Clinton's platform was resonating with them. Greenberg describes himself as weeping over this because he says, my entire life's work up until that point had been trying to figure out a way to bring back together Black and white workers. And I could see this happening right in front of me. And if Schoen's story is for some, in one way I think about the book is that I'm telling this common story about the transformation of the left. But for Schoen, that's kind of a comedy because he just wanted to win elections, but he never really expected much from politics. For Greenberg, it's a tragedy though, because he wanted something different than what we have now. And he worked so hard to try and make it a reality. And in some sense, he got extraordinarily close. He enjoyed a degree of influence that's much, much, much more than the tenured radical that he easily could have been. You know, he starts off in the 1980s writing these academic monographs with these learned citations to Marx and Lenin and Gramsci in them. And by barely a decade later, after not getting tenure at Yale, he's whispering in the ear of the newly elected president of the United States. But despite that remarkable transformation, he never comes close to delivering on the project that brought him into this in the first place. And there's something admirable about that, I do think, at the end of the day. If not the failure, then at least the attempt.
And let's just briefly go back to Clinton. I lived through that period. I'm older than you. It always occurred to me, I'm not an expert like you, that Clinton himself was a prisoner of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. And Clinton and Blair were very much in similar positions. Is that true? Did Greenberg and Schoen recognize that they had to essentially buy in to the Reagan ideology to win elections?
Well, much more than I think it's remembered today, Clinton's 1992 campaign in particular, which really does work out of this Carville-Greenberg playbook, it ran hard on economic populism. It took really tough shots at Reagan and at the inequality that emerged out of the 1980s. And what happens over the arc of the Clinton years is that the economic populist parts, for whether it's the middle class tax cut or most ambitiously the universal healthcare program, those don't go anywhere. Right? They get the middle class tax cut gets dropped, traded for deficit reduction almost right away. Universal healthcare, a notorious failure, but you do get NAFTA, you do get deregulation, you do get the more neoliberal parts of the agenda. And at first, this is seen as sort of defeats for Clinton's failure or shortcomings. But by the end of the Clinton years, the temptation is just to celebrate the victories, to congratulate yourself on the steady economic growth, to talk about the wonders of the new economy, and to forget all the stuff that wasn't passed along the way. So rhetorically, at least, it's definitely there was an attempted break in 1992. It just didn't translate into the political policy change that some of the people in Clinton's orbit sincerely did work for. In a sense, that Clinton was he was not born but became a true neoliberal over the course of his administration.
Tim, one of the standard centrist critiques of what happened to liberal politics is that the elites retreated into the university and became preoccupied with race and gender. What's your take on that? How does the Greenberg-Schoen rivalry play into that?
What I saw through Greenberg and Schoen, and this is not just in the United States, it's with the clients that they work with around the world. And one striking thing is, especially comes through with Greenberg, he says, I listen to these focus groups everywhere. They can be in the US, they can be in the UK, they can be in South Africa. And yes, there are important national differences wherever you go. But the same handful of issues do tend to recur wherever I land. It's jobs, it's housing, it's education, it's healthcare, it's personal safety. The stuff that we would think you need to lead a kind of decent, basic middle class life in the United States. And what most people, most of the time, this is sort of the 90% of people who really don't want to have to think about politics much, but do want a better life for themselves and their children, and do believe, often have a sense that society isn't it's the game is rigged against them, that they're doing the best they can, but that the rich and the powerful really do have an easier time of things. That basic intuition is a lot more common than we might expect. And that a political system that pays attention to those basic concerns, to the ways that government can make a difference in people's lives, make getting those basic elements of middle class life easier, that's something that resonates with the concerns of these ordinary voters in a way that now, I will say in American politics recently, one of those kitchen table issues is abortion rights, right? This isn't a strict just pocketbook politics versus cultural issues, but it is definitely the case that the politically engaged class is sort of 10% or so of any given electorate that really focuses on this stuff. They often tend to have a set of concerns that diverge wildly from that 90%, and that for someone in my politics seem like can be addressed with a respectable set of social democratic policies, if only we can make our way through this deeply broken political system.
And do Greenberg and Schoen, in their own ways, did they recognize the consolidation of power within the Democratic Party amongst liberal politics in the university, in the elites of the East and the West Coast, of people who had no contact or involvement with the American working class, perhaps summarized best by Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary Clinton?
Absolutely. These are things that they see firsthand. I mean, these are the interesting role of a Greenberg or a Schoen. So Greenberg, he comes from a working class background, but by the time he arrives at Harvard as a graduate student in the 1960s, he's comfortably of this educated class. And from Harvard to Yale as a professor to the upper ranks of the Democratic political elite, he never looks back. And was shown he's someone who is born into privilege in Manhattan. He's the child of a successful corporate lawyer, Harvard for undergrad, Oxford for a fellowship, and then lucrative career in political and eventually corporate consulting down the line. So none of them are sort of tribunes of the working class in a conventional sense. But Greenberg in particular takes these questions about class very seriously. He has this committed background. He is one of those radical academics who in his grad student days is reading Gramsci and the rest. And shown as someone who just knows how to count to 51% and will do whatever it takes to get there. And in both cases, they see the emergence of this progressive, educated class that they're often sympathetic to, especially with Greenberg on matters of policy, but who they think have just fundamentally mistaken views about how politics works. And for Greenberg in particular, this really comes home in 1968 when he's a grad student at Harvard and agrees to do a research project for Bobby Kennedy's 1968 campaign. And the project he's doing, he studies the results of the Indiana primary, where Bobby Kennedy was going up against Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy, who at the time was the darling of the New Left, the student protesters, because he was the first candidate to jump into the race against LBJ over Vietnam. And what Greenberg finds when he looks at the results of the Indiana primary is that Bobby Kennedy's voters were reliably working class, black and white. It was a cross-racial working class coalition. By contrast, McCarthy supporters, they were basically college kids and their affluent parents. And that this divide Greenberg sees is a fundamental choice for the Democratic Party coming out of the 1960s. Will they try to rebuild that New Deal coalition in the way that looking at RFK, he thought was possible? Or are they going to go down this McCarthyite route? Eugene McCarthyite, I emphasize, not Joe McCarthyite. And again, the sort of tragedy of his career is that despite all of his efforts, he can see the party drifting farther and farther away from what he wanted it to be. But he does recognize that there is a choice there.
Yeah, you're certainly not the first or the last to note Bobby Kennedy's ability to bring the white and the black working class together and to keep a distance, at least, from these new technocratic elites. Do you think Bobby Kennedy was able to do it because he was part of a political aristocracy, and that for somebody like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, it was a much harder thing to do?
And this is that's definitely a part of the story. And I will say this is also why I like having Schoen in the picture, because one reason why Greenberg and Schoen have this sort of intense personal rivalry, partly it's because they're sort of constantly competing for the same clients. So naturally, there's going to be some grudges that develop over time. But they also have this fundamental disagreement about elections. And for Greenberg, in Schoen's eyes, Greenberg is an ideologue who is so committed to what Greenberg calls the class project that he can't admit that there are other ways to run a campaign, and he blinds himself to the realities of electoral politics. And for Schoen, he's really drawn to figures like Ben Wanberg, Richard Scammon, who in 1970 write a kind of forgotten book that's a really powerful rejoinder to Kevin Phillips on the emerging Republican majority. This Scammon Wanberg book, it's called The Real Majority. And among other things, it takes aim at what it calls this emerging myth of Bobby Kennedy, that Kennedy could have been this transformative figure. Because they point out, okay, it's one thing to build this multiracial coalition when you're running against Gene McCarthy. What happens if you're running against Richard Nixon? What happens if you're running against someone who's making a play for those white working class voters, and you are going to be the one adopting the progressive line down the board? But while that's well taken, I would say that it's also important to keep in mind that as late as 2008, the rough outlines of the Democratic coalition that puts Barack Obama to the White House thoroughly grounded in the bottom half of the electorate. He does best with voters in the bottom half of the income distribution, worse with voters in the next 40%, and worst of all with voters in the top 10%. There's been a profound change in that in the last 16 years. But it says to me that it's not just a case of trying to bring back the politics of 1936. It's talking about getting back to a world that was around not that long ago.
And then I'm assuming that Greenberg wrote Schoen off because he was a centrist and had no moral.
Well, that's where sort of Greenberg's old inner Marxist really comes out aggressively. He sees Schoen and Penn as sort of the cleanup crew that come in when the candidates who he helps put into office on these economic promises of economic populism and cultural moderation. The great frustration for Greenberg is that he sees, not just with Clinton in the United States, but with Blair in the UK and time and again around the world, that when those candidates, they repeat the Clinton pattern. They fail to deliver on the economic populism, the meaningful improvements for working people, and they end up justifying themselves based mostly on cultural victories. So if you are a economic progressive, a working class person who leans to the left on economics and to the center or right on culture, which is a very common pattern, you might vote for a progressive candidate one time and end up getting the exact opposite of what was delivered to you. And Greenberg sees Penn and Schoen as the sort of soulless hacks who are brought in to do electoral cleanup work. They come up with this patch job to get candidates to just enough to the center so that they can win elections, but without any larger political project behind it, which he views as fundamentally empty. And again, you can see here why Schoen might end up thinking that Greenberg is a bit of an ideologue.
Isn't there something structural about this, though, Tim? In a way, it always seems to happen on the left. It's happened. It just happened in the UK in the election. If Harris gets elected, she's certainly going to be much more of a centrist than Biden. That this is always the consequence of liberals when they get elected. They're ambitious. It may have happened in the first Clinton presidency. It happened under Obama, and they always retreat to foreign policy and cultural symbolism and retreat on the economic front. Is that wrong?
I would have been inclined to agree with you more or less completely, although disappointingly, until Joe Biden came along. I actually think, and one reason why I decided to write this book, another one is that seeing Greenberg lay out this dynamic so clearly, which he does in a 2009 memoir published right at the start of Obama's administration. And then I agree that Obama does fit to that sort of model of Clintonite disappointment pretty well, therefore setting the stage for Trump. But Biden really didn't. That neoliberal turn never really came for him. You saw instead a commitment, which is lasting down to the present, toward reviving what he sees of as a kind of working class blue collar politics. Now, I think that the great mistake of the Biden administration, unfortunately, is discovering that you can have the big policy changes, but if you don't deliver on real improvements in wages for most Americans, which those median wages fell during the first 2 years that Biden was in office, then you're going to run into real political trouble. But it tells me that in this period of ferment, there might be possibility for change. Now, of course, a pattern that's repeated itself so many times, that says that something big and structural is happening here. It's not just a question of a handful of people making the right decisions. But one benefit of being a college educated progressive, writing for other college educated progressives, because let's be real, that's what I'm doing here with this book, is that I feel like I can tell the people in my tribe, like, listen, other progressives, if we are as empathetic and as thoughtful and as perceptive as we say we are, can't we acknowledge that even if we are a part of the Democratic coalition, if we deserve a place on the bus, but we don't get to drive the bus, especially if we want to deal with this sort of break out of the polarized cycle of politics, which turns politics into this endless culture war, and that somehow seems to keep turning election after election into this agonizing nail biter. If we want to get to the numbers that are capable of providing Democrats with the electoral muscle that they need to push through the reforms structural economic reforms we believe in, and deliver Republicans a large enough defeat that they might take a hard look at the sort of excesses of the Trump years and ditch them because they think that they're no longer politically affordable. The only way to do that is with fixing the Democratic Party's relationship with this broad swath of working and middle class Americans.
So we don't have a lot of time, Tim. What exactly did that mean? You mentioned Biden. I think that one of the reasons why he seems to have succeeded on the left is because there was such a surreal quality to his presidency, maybe bound up in part with COVID, is that he was never able to articulate what he was doing, even when he was more articulate than he is today. And he never really coherently was able to articulate a vision. So it was almost like accidental stealth under Biden. Am I being unkind? I mean, as you can tell, I'm not his greatest fan.
I would say, too, it's just a reflection of the influence of this permanent Democratic political policy class in Washington. That these are people who, it might be underrated, the degree to which people in politics are there because they want to get things done. And I think especially the 1-2 punch of the Trump years and then COVID, I think it encouraged a lot of wonks and bureaucrats to think big in a way that they didn't before. And also this perception that the lesson of the Obama years was not to go too small on the stimulus, to really reach for change when you had it within grasp. And Biden himself, useful electorally, but I don't think that he was sort of the man behind the scenes on a lot of these key policy questions. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing about Biden is who knows who's actually pulling the strings. Let's talk briefly about Harris Waltz. I wonder whether, in your view, the problem with Harris Waltz on an ideological level is that they basically encompass the entire political gamut from Cheney to AOC. So they're really bereft of any kind of ideology, which explains why whenever you ask Harris what kind of president she wants to be and what she wants to stand for, she's utterly incoherent.
And it's thrown into even starker relief when you compare it to the campaign that she ran in 2019. When I was writing about this originally, it's like, oh yeah, Harris's 2020 presidential campaign, and I forgot that she actually had to drop out in December of 2019 because she didn't make it that far. But she
it was so unmemorable, you forgot that.
Or just sort of the flame out was so spectacular. But when she was trying to get with a party that she thought was moving in this much more aggressively leftward direction, I think that the problem that Harris is facing now is that on some sense, she gets the benefit of voters who are looking to turn the page, her slogan, gets benefit from them because at least she is not Donald Trump and she's not Joe Biden, as she doesn't tire of pointing out, right? She is going to be a different person, but she's failed to put in anything other sort of substantively that voters can take home, aside from, I think, I will not try to overturn election results, and I'm going to try to defend
Well, yeah,
abortion
big
rights.
deal. So,
But this is, so it's the anti-Trump and abortion rights coalition, which is sort of the default setting, I think, of Democratic politics in the Trump era. Now, which is not to say she has put up policies, many of which do gesture at this more economic populist direction. But the problem is that without a sort of coherent vision to make sense of them, I think that they just get lost in the noise. And instead you get, oh yeah, Kamala Harris, she thinks that defending democracy is brat. You know, the Dick Cheney to Charlie XCX coalition, even more than the Cheney to AOC coalition, I think is what most people probably have in their heads at this point. And that might be enough to win the election. But for these sort of, again, more economically progressive, culturally moderate voters, who are the swing voters who often determine elections, they are much more transactional in their approach to politics. They want to know, how is this going to benefit me? And without that clear economic statement, combined with ideally a sense from Harris that she understands why so many voters are so frustrated, why they feel that the system doesn't work for them, that you can be opposed to overturning elections without also apologizing for everything in American politics, from Dick Cheney to Joe Biden, that they're just going to feel either that these swing voters are either going to tune out, or maybe decide in enough numbers that the Trump economy was good enough in the pre-COVID years to justify another roll of the dice with him.
you used the T word, both transactional and Trump, and of course those two go together. How does Trump fit into this? Is he, you know, there seems to be two readings. On the one hand, he's this extraordinary figure who doesn't fit into any category, and when he's done, and everything will go back to normal. And there's the other argument that he somehow reflects a fundamental structural shift in the nature of America, of American politics, maybe a shift from the class cleavage to the gender cleavage. I mean, it's young men, both white, black, brown young men, who seem to like Trump. Harris is winning massive support amongst women. What does Trump tell us? Is he, again, and I know that the answer will be both, is he a cause or a consequence of these new cleavages?
Oh, and of course the answer is both, but I would say much more consequence. And this is one benefit of this book. You mentioned Realigners, my last book. It's very American in its focus. It tells a story about these rise and fall majorities in the United States over the very long run. This one begins in the United States, but I follow these arguments between Penn and Schoen, Greenberg and Carville. I follow them as they travel around the world, having different versions of this fight. So in the UK, they have
Germany, I'm guessing. Germany is always so important on this front.
UK, Germany's important. South Africa, surprisingly, is a place where they overlap, and Israel. And what you see here, if the question in our mind is, in sense, what makes Trump distinctive? Another way you could put it is, can we have Trumpism without Trump? And I say we already do, just not in the United States. Cast your eyes around the world, though, and there are plenty of examples of right-wing populists in the mold of Trump who move their parties away from traditional traditional associations with big business, make their peace with broad aspects of the welfare state, and go hard on the culture war. And it is no coincidence, I think, for instance, that in 2019, when Boris Johnson is trying to put the nail in Jeremy Corbyn's career, what does he do? Johnson says he's going to be the best defender of the NHS that Britain's ever seen, and he's going to get Brexit done. That combination of economic moderation and cultural populism, which is almost a flip side of the formula that Greenberg was prescribing for his center-left clients, who included Tony Blair, who included Ehud Barak, who included Gerhard Schroeder, a number of these key figures. Well, in a sense, Trump, Johnson end up picking a kind of mirrored version, or following a mirrored version of this neoliberal formula from the Blair Clinton years. Even as they're rejecting the policy, they're embracing key lessons from the politics.
So much to talk about, Tim. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. I'm sure you've got to run. You mentioned Boris Johnson, another flagrant liar, like Trump, very liberal with the truth. We talked about the 1990s and Greenberg and Schoen and the Clinton years. The other thing that, of course, happened was the internet, and then Web 2, social media, the undermining of truth, at least in many people's eyes. To what extent has technology influenced the way in which we get politicians like Trump and Johnson on the right, although I don't see why they couldn't exist on the left? They do in Venezuela, whose whole political ideology seems to be rooted in simply mythologizing everything, themselves, their policies, their country, the world.
So my inclination with this is always to say that they probably take what would have been a bad problem anyway and make it worse, but that the underlying challenge here goes back to just the eruption of cultural polarization coming out of the 1960s, and that until the left figures out a satisfying way to respond to that, no amount of technological fixes are going to get the problem solved. So it's not as if, if Facebook and Twitter and all the rest disappeared overnight. I still think that these basic political issues would be there to be dealt with.
So you still would you have guys like Trump and Johnson who just basically lie all the time and aren't even shy to admit it, and it doesn't seem to affect the electorate? I mean, what would Greenberg or Schoen say to their clients if they were consummate liars? I mean, Bill Clinton lied about Monica Lewinsky, but he didn't lie about big policy issues, at least flagrantly, did he?
Well, and this is, of course, in American history, going back to Vietnam, for instance, when Schoen and Greenberg are coming of age, the US government doesn't exactly do a good job building up faith in its credibility over that period. But that's also seen as a scandal. I think, though, that in a sense that this is just cope for a lot of liberals and a lot of leftists, and that the harder thing to face straight up is that it's not the lies, it's the truth, or at least the truth in the sense that Trump and Johnson do well because they position themselves as more moderate figures, more in line with voters than what the left was doing at that time. I don't think that the left is powerless in its response, but that all of the social media insanity and the rest, it doesn't help, but that the core element of Trump's strength, of Johnson's strength, is that they have these policy positions which just resonate with many, many more people than the left would often like to recognize.
You've mentioned Gramsci a few times. Of course, Gramsci had a whole theory of morbid symptoms, of history being made up of periods and these transitional periods where nothing was ever clear. To what extent are we living through a Gramscian period of symptomatic of morbidity, where the old system is dying and the new one hasn't come into being? One of the reviews of your book by Jeff Schellenberger says that the 2024 election isn't really that different from anything that happened since 1968. We're still dealing with this structural realignment. So are we still in that fog of Gramscian horror when one system's dead and the other one hasn't come into being?
This is, well, one reason why I'm not a Marxist is that I don't trust social totalities. I think it's easy to break. I think it's much more helpful to think about how the system breaks apart to fractures and where the pieces don't hold together. I think we clearly have a political system that's dealing with a serious amount of sclerosis. On the other hand, who knows what AI is going to do to the economy, to the world, to daily life in the next 10 years. I think that there's definitely the possibility for radical change out there, but I think that if we don't want the sort of robot overlords to be braining over a still polarized politics, that this basic problem that simultaneously wasn't invented by Donald Trump, but also doesn't go back to the American founding, isn't written in our national DNA in some way. This problem that emerged within the lifetime of my mom and got worse in my own lifetime. I think that we can make significant progress on dealing with it, at least maybe not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my sons.
Final question, Tim. Your book is built around a couple of pollsters. If Harrison Waltz came to you and said, Tim, what should we be doing to win this permanent majority, to do away with these close elections? What should the left do to win a new coalition, a coalition that can perhaps go back to the 60s and before, maybe even back to the New Deal, but be a different kind of coalition?
I think that rhetorically, it begins by showing that you really are a different type of Democrat, that you recognize that mistakes have been made and you're committed to doing something different. And that something different means delivering on real improvements in standards of living for ordinary Americans in the short term while building up worker power over the long run. And it involves recognizing that these sort of particular concerns of educated activists on both the right and the left, while they have a place in politics, don't have to be at the center of the center of life. And that the questions that are on the top of mind for ordinary Americans are going to be on the top of mind of the Harris administration as well. It's a long, long process, but that work, which can also include doing more to recruit actual working class candidates to run for office, as opposed to the latest model to just roll off the assembly line of the Ivy League, and is a commitment that's outlined in policy, defended on the campaign trail, held up by candidates who voters can see themselves in, and then just delivered on constantly. That is the way that we can begin to make serious progress on this problem.
And is anyone doing it? I mean, people always come on my show and talk about the Danish model. I think half the people who bring up the Danish model don't even know where Denmark is. But are there any parties or countries in the world where this new coalition could be used as an advertisement for the viability of a new progressive coalition?
Listen, I hate to point out the UK as an example, but given the sort of disasters that the Starmer government has run into recently, but if you're going to take the Danish model off the table for me, then I will say,
well, no, you can have the Danish model.
No, it's fine, it's fine. But Starmer is.
It just always seems that the Danish model is so exclusive to Denmark.
Yeah, but what we saw even in the recent UK elections was that the Starmer is able to get into power because he does close this education polarization gap. And that's a product of a concerted political strategy. Didn't happen by accident. It was an overriding goal of the Starmer political team to be able to improve labor's performance with voters who didn't go to college. And they even gave up some of those gains with college educated voters that they'd seen over the last generation. Now, Starmer's had a lot of trouble turning this into meaningful policy change, but it's a sign that these problems aren't irreversible, that there's still a possibility for improvement even now.
Well, finally, Tim, I got to ask you, it's a very unfair question. What's going to happen in the election?
So polls say it's 50-50. Seems okay for Harris right now, but I've been wrong before. But the problem is, of course, that whatever happens, it's going to be a narrowly divided government. And
so back to my question, does it really matter who wins? Does it really make much difference?
Yeah, it matters who wins, just because you don't want Donald Trump to be in charge of election. You don't want anyone in the Trump administration, at least by my lights, to be in charge of validating election results ever again after what happened on January 6th and the month-long campaign to overturn the election that preceded January 6th. So for that avoiding of a bare minimum, for maintaining those bare minimum standards, I will have my fingers crossed for Harris. But the other point is, if the next election really isn't the most important of our lifetimes, that means the work of coming up with a better answer to these problems, that can start as soon as the election is over.
Well, it's all uncertain. The one thing we can say for sure is that Timothy Shenk will come back on our show, not before the 2024 but certainly before the 2028 election. Very interesting young scholar, thinker on American politics. Thank you so much, and best of luck with your